Okay, so good morning, everyone. Good evening in Israel and in Europe, and good afternoon in the East Coast. My name is Ophir Gutelson, co-founder of Unacceptable, based in Palo Alto, San Francisco. And we are joined today by Eran Etzion, which I'll introduce in a second. Thank you, everyone who's joining. We are still waiting for a couple of, for at least 100 people more, so bear with us. And we are joining while it's 8 p.m. in Israel. And it's the 620 day since the Gaza war started, since October 7. We have 53 hostages still in captivity by Hamas, and we are 4 days into the Iran-Israel war that started on Friday the 13th, June 13th. Which is an interesting date. So just a quick recap for those who doesn't know Unacceptable. Unacceptable is a grassroots movement started somewhere back 5 years ago for saving Israeli democracy. We care a lot about Israel. We care a lot about the values of Israel. We care a lot about our brothers and sisters in Israel, and we work in parallel in connection with the Jewish community, the leadership of the Jewish community. And we are trying to do our best to make sure that the trajectory of Israel going forward, many years forward, will stay liberal, Jewish democracy that seek for peace and looking for doing good in the world. So I will start quickly by introducing Iran. That I think that most of you might be following him on Twitter, and if you don't, you should. Iran is being most known for heading the policy planning at the Israeli of Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a deputy head of the National Security Council in the Prime Minister office. And Eran, you will explain us more what is this, is this place about, and what planning you are doing there or did there. And as we speak, I will let you know if there are alarms in Israel, and if our friends in Israel, please stay safe if you are. This is also, of course, recorded, and keep yourself really following the orders of the army when it comes. Eran, would like to start by, again, just tell a little bit about yourself, what you've
Sure.
done, and give us a quick like a summary of where we are today, because every minute things are changing, so I don't even know what to ask anymore after bombing tonight Israel, Iran's. So please give us your review.
All right. Good morning, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Phil, for hosting me. A few words about myself. I was in government for over 20 years in various capacities in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I was pretty fortunate to work on some very critical files, including being involved in the Oslo process back in the 90s, and then in the negotiations with Syria in White Plantation. Then I was consul actually in San Francisco, from probably many of you are now watching. Between 96 and 2000, I was consul there. Then I joined the National Security Council, which was in its nascent phase at the time, and I served in two capacities. One was chief of staff for a number of heads of NSC, National Security Advisors, including Giora Eiland, Ephraim Halevi, former head of Mossad, Uzi Dayan, former deputy chief of staff of the IDF, and so on. And then I became deputy head of the NSC, a job I had for over 4 years, in the course of which I dealt with the Gaza disengagement, the Iranian nuclear issue, the Second Lebanon War, strategic dialogue with the US, and many other issues. And then I went back to the Foreign Ministry, head of policy planning, for another 4 years, dealt again with all those big issues from the perspective of the Foreign Ministry, which in Israel, unfortunately, is marginalized, has been marginalized for decades. And I was struggling to kind of bring the strategic diplomatic considerations to the highest decision-making table, i.e. the National Security Cabinet. And then I left in 2014 and became an entrepreneur. I have a startup that is doing participatory democracy and joint decision-making, civic participation, and so on. Fascinating stuff, very interesting, and very pertinent to the future of democracy and to transparency and proper governance and stuff like that. We're working with many government ministries and municipalities. And I'm in my other hat, I have something of a public profile. As was mentioned, I have an active Twitter account. I'm active in civic diplomacy in so-called track 2 negotiations or meetings with many actors from the region and the international arena, Palestinians, Saudis, Emiratis, Americans, Egyptians, Europeans, and others. And I'm also active politically in the Democratic Party, the Israeli Democratic Party, with Yair Golan, who some of you are maybe familiar with. So that's me in a nutshell. Now let's talk about the matzav, the situation. I'll start by saying that it took many people by surprise, including myself. I did take into account the possibility of a war of choice between Israel and Iran initiated by this government, but I didn't give it a very high probability until recently. Then it became kind of more and more, we had more and more early indications of that, but still, this is a move of such magnitude that a lot of people were skeptical in terms of the actual probability of it actually occurring. And there is a very important question, which in American colloquial speech would be formulated more or less like, how did we get here? Why did eventually the Israeli cabinet decided to launch the first ever major war against a state since 1973? Because all of our wars between 73 and now were not against states, but against non-state actors. The first ever war against Iran, even though, yes, we had clashes with them, but we didn't have a full-scale war. And the first ever war, which is centered around, at least kind of manifestly, around a nuclear project. And it is a very big question.
Because we did have other interaction with nuclear before, but it never was in a war
Ignited a
situation.
war. Right, exactly. And in terms of the planning, it was clear, or let's put it this way, the probability of the move igniting an overall war was relatively low. And it was planned accordingly. We didn't take responsibility and so on and so forth. This is very different. So the government argument would be, some of it is already being made, and some of it I suspect will be made as we go along, that it's not really a war of choice, but a war of no choice. מלחמת אין ברירה בעברית. It is a very loaded meaning in Hebrew. And we had no choice except launching this war. Why? Because we had new information, new intelligence that proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Iran was indeed pursuing a nuclear weapon, despite of its stated policy, despite of all intelligence reports, including those in the US, until very recently, that stated and those of the IAEA, the International Atomic Agency, and Atomic Energy Agency, that actually negated the possibility of Iran pursuing a nuclear weapon, including the very last IAEA report, which was very severe and with unprecedented language, but did not show any new evidence. All it spoke about was the old program of 2003, which Iran claims was closed and not renewed. And the IAEA is not negating this. It's just saying that Iran is not cooperating, and therefore there is no solid proof that indeed they have closed the weapons program, but there is no proof of the opposite, that they have an active nuclear weapon program. So it appears that Israel does have some new intelligence that Israel interprets as such that necessitates taking action. But it was not presented to the public. It was not presented to the UN Security Council. It was not presented to the IAEA, as far as I know. And therefore, you have to take their word for it, or not. And of course, I won't go into the entire kind of political channel, but it's clear that the level of trust in Netanyahu personally, in Netanyahu's government more generally, and in their statements and in their intentions and so on, is very low. And therefore, one would be advised to be very cautious in taking their words for the so-called clear cause for launching this war. So that's the first point. The second, which is very pertinent to you guys as Americans or resident citizens of America or whatnot, is where is Trump in all of this? And here too, there's a lot of ambiguity. There is an argument to be made that Trump was in on it from day one, and actually he and Israel played a very sophisticated con game designed to fool the Iranians that there is actual kind of straightforward negotiations between the Americans and the Iranians, and that there is a real American intent to reach a new nuclear deal, and kind of they were fooled to believe that this is actually what's going on. It's possible that it was a major kind of strategic deviation or strategic con game played by Trump and Netanyahu, and that it succeeded to fool the Iranians. There is an alternative theory that states that actually the level of coordination was not that high, and that in fact Trump was pulled in gradually by Netanyahu, not by way of collusion, but by way of, there is a Spanish term that Ariel Sharon was very fond of. It's called corrales. Don't know if anyone here knows it. It's a primitive kind of structure that goes back at least hundreds, if not thousands of years, that was used to hunt cattle or deer. And you have essentially very low brick walls constructed usually in a kind of open terrain, the desert or something like that. In like a triangle or almost a triangle, you have those two low walls that are kind of getting closer and closer to each other and creating this kind of a triangle with a small opening at the end. And at this very end, there is another wall and a hole, and the cattle is simply kind of it is forced to run through this corrales and then fall to its death. Sharon, as the owner of a ranch and with a lot of experience with cattle, used this analogy a lot in the political and strategic life. And he was oftentimes under the impression that he was being pushed by the Americans into such a corrales on the Palestinian issue. So all this long story about corrales is just to illustrate that it is possible that Trump was led into such a corrales by Netanyahu, kind of gradually forcing him into abandoning the negotiations track and jumping on the war wagon for whatever reason. It's always very hard to read what motivates Trump. So we'll see about that. But these are the two options. Whether one is that there was full coordination, the other is that there was not.
Iran, just a mixed question on this point. I mean, do you think that the same intelligence, that Israel and America has the same intelligence about this potential breakthrough in nuclear? I mean, and they just decided to act on it differently?
I don't think they have the same intelligence. Again, I don't know, but I don't think that's the situation. I think Israel brought the intelligence, tried to quote unquote sell it to the Americans. Maybe some of them bought it and some of them did not. It's not going to be the first time that there are those kinds of disagreements on the significance of some intelligence material. It's a common practice in the dialogue between Israeli and American intelligence services. And the degree of trust is not great historically. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were differences of opinion. However, again, I leave room for the possibility that the intelligence was, as strong as it can be, and that the Americans said, "Okay, fine, we're convinced, and let's not reveal it. Let's go into this elaborate scheme of conning not only the Iranians, but also the Americans, the Israeli public, and the world, that we're actually negotiating in good faith, but pull the rug below the Iranians by launching this war in a surprise attack." So that's the second question of where Trump is. And of course, now, and I'll come to it in a minute, the question becomes the question is now kind of forward-looking. When and how and if and under which conditions will Trump authorize the use of military force, American military force, against Iran?
And I'll just give a context around just a minute for context. Last night, bombing from missiles from Iran landed 400 meters from the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. And it's a known public information, and so I'm not sharing anything new. So that could be a trigger, just FYI.
So the next thing I want to touch is what are the actual war aims of Israel. And here too, first of all, I want to emphasize that I'm not speaking out of any kind of secret or intelligence or kind of inside information, just as a concerned citizen with some experience. And what we can surmise so far, number one is obviously Israel is targeting the Iranian nuclear project, probably not with the definition of eliminating it altogether, because it's not really possible at this point. Not for Israel, probably also not for America, for a variety of reasons. They have the know-how, they have the materials. It's too late in the game. The only thing that can now actually roll back and eliminate the Iranian nuclear project is an Iranian decision. What is called the Libyan model, if you remember. Libya had some nuclear capabilities, and it decided under pressure, but it was Gaddafi's decision to relinquish it, to eliminate it altogether. Short of such an Iranian decision, it's not possible to eliminate their project. And therefore, I suspect that the actual war aim of Israel is not eliminating it, but stalling it, damaging it significantly. You could imagine all sorts of wordings for it that fall short of elimination. The second target is the Iranian surface-to-surface and surface-to-air missiles apparatus, both the missiles they already have and also the manufacturing capability of these missiles, which Netanyahu claims has become a strategic threat on a similar level to the nuclear threat. Here, I disagree with that description of the severity of this threat. I don't think it's in any way near the severity of the nuclear threat, but this is the narrative that Netanyahu is selling, and probably these are the war aims. So here too, it's not about eliminating Iran's entire missiles capacity or even its production capacity, but hurting it significantly. And now we come to the big elephant in the room, which is the Iranian regime and the prospect of a regime change. I find it very difficult to believe that there was an actual formal cabinet decision in Israel to change the Iranian regime. I want to believe that even if Netanyahu tried to bring about such a decision, there was enough of a spine left around the room in uniform and without uniform, in the shape of the chief of staff of the IDF and the head of Mossad and the head of Shin Bet, the outgoing head of Shin Bet and others, to stand up and say, we cannot sign off on such a war goal because we simply don't have the capacity to do it. Israel doesn't have the capacity to change the Iranian regime. Even the US doesn't have that capacity, I would contend, and certainly not Israel alone. And therefore, I hope that this is not one of the war aims. However, there is most probably a war aim that states something like hurting the Iranian regime to a degree that would coerce it to change its positions on the nuclear issue. Something like that. Which correlates with what we're seeing so far. You know, the kind of targeting and so on.
And do you think
So
there is a correlation
yeah.
between, do you think there is some connection, maybe based on what we have seen from the action of the Mossad on the ground with the opposition in Iran about that?
Possibly, but let's say a few words very briefly about that. And if you want, I can send you later some interesting, very long tweet that I just read by somebody who wrote a whole book about the prospects of a regime change in Iran. He's not the only one, but I agree with what he wrote. And the consensus among the experts, almost consensus, okay, there's never a full consensus among Iranian experts on almost anything, but there is a wide-ranging view that, first of all, changing the regime by military means is next to impossible because the effect of a war that, like the one we're now engaged in, or even a bigger one with US involvement, is going to be the so-called rally around the flag. And the Iranian people will not want, even those who obviously dislike the regime and were hurt by the regime and so on, they would not want to be seen as taking over on Israeli or American bayonets. That's one. The other is that in all probability, in a situation of a regime change, those who will take power will not be the Democrats or the pragmatists, but probably some extreme elements which might even be more extreme, or certainly not less extreme than the outgoing regime. So it's going to be a situation like, you know, a gang war, where one gang of ayatollahs depart and another gang of who knows what, military people, IGRC, another set of ayatollahs, I don't know, but not the ones that Westerners, when they speak about regime change, not the ones that we would like to see. So this is kind of the overall framework in terms of the war goals. Now let's talk about what are the possible scenarios from here on. And I can see 4 possible scenarios. Yes, Ophir, you want to say something?
Yes, I just want to add again a little bit context. I mean, this is the
Yes.
scenario. I mean, the preparation for this war was a long time in the making, I assume, and the scenario that Netanyahu and the government and the army was taking into consideration, according to what published in the media, is that this is going to be, and maybe you can elaborate more about it, this is going to be a long war or a short war, but with a lot of casualties. Like they're talking about 800 to 4,000 people casualties. So the scenario is taking this into consideration. You can probably elaborate on that, and that's important to understand in this context. It's not just removing a couple of missiles in Syria, for example.
Yes, but here the problem with this line of thinking is what I said before. We don't have enough information, most specifically about the level of coordination of the Americans. Let's put it this way. If the level of coordination is such, and this is purely speculative, that by way of an example, okay, it is agreed beforehand between the Israelis and the Americans.
I'm getting an alert that there is an attack right now as we speak in Israel right now. So please take cover whoever is in Israel right now. And I will post anything that is relevant. But yeah, sorry, Eran, go ahead.
Sure. So if there is this level of very close coordination, as an example, that after 10 days of constant Israeli bombardments, this is the cue for the American military to step in and, for example, take care of the Fordow installation, which is buried deep in a mountain. Israel doesn't have the capacity to inflict any damage there, but the Americans do. So if, for example, we have that level of coordination, one can imagine that this war might not take very long. On the contrary, or on the other hand, if we don't have that level of coordination, and we launched the way we did, we're inflicting the damage that we're inflicting, and I'll come to it in a minute with the scenarios, we might very well be looking at not only weeks and perhaps not only months, but even years of ongoing friction and different levels of conflict, armed conflict between Israel and Iran. So I don't know. I don't know enough to say. But this is one of the reasons I prefer to speak in scenarios, okay?
Yeah, go
Because we
ahead.
don't have enough information. So the first scenario is kind of the best case scenario from Israel's perspective, which is the one that Netanyahu is trying to sell, which essentially says, the regime is already on the verge of collapse. And, within a few days, maybe a few weeks, it will collapse. And it can collapse kind of, let's for the sake of simplification, like Hezbollah and Syria collapsed. In other words, one day you have a regime, the next day you don't, and everything changes. Or it can collapse in a more orderly way by way of simply realizing that the only way to prevent the regime from elimination is to sign essentially a surrendering agreement, accept the Israeli and American terms, eliminate the nuclear project, eliminate the missiles project, and accept the most intrusive mechanisms for verification by the IAEA or maybe even by Americans, who knows? Kind of the dream agreement. And this is the first scenario. I don't give it very high probability, to say the least. I cannot say that it's totally impossible, like perhaps I would have said even a few weeks or a few months ago. Now I cannot say that it's totally impossible because things are happening very quickly. But I still think, and again, the key factor is the level of coordination and what is America willing or not willing to do. But there is such a scenario with low probability. The second scenario goes to the other extreme and essentially says that the Iranian regime decides that in order to survive, it needs to escalate dramatically. And dramatic escalation can be breaking to a bomb, either by using whatever means they have now, which we perhaps don't fully know. And, potentially they could race to a bomb with whatever they have. Potentially they could also get a bomb from North Korea, from Pakistan, wherever. And they would race to a bomb in order to protect the regime. And if you want, take advantage of this war from their perspective. Use, instead of, it's always in strategy, you have the risk and opportunity equation. The depth of the risk sometimes equals the breadth of the opportunity. So from their perspective, this would be taking the opportunity to the extreme. And also they could escalate by blocking the Hormuz Straits and spiking oil prices globally. They could escalate by targeting a certain oil field of a small GCC member like Bahrain or Kuwait, if they don't want to mess with Saudi and the Emirates, which they don't. They could also target some American targets by proxies. There are a lot of things they can do in order to escalate. So that's the second scenario, and it would probably draw the Americans in. Okay, that's kind of the downside from their perspective of this scenario. But again, if they come to a conclusion that America, for example, okay, if they come to a conclusion that the level of coordination is such that America is already going to come in any case, for example, not today, 25 fueling military airplanes flew from the US to Europe in an unprecedented kind of scale of such a group of airplanes. They might come to the conclusion that it's going to happen in any case, so let's escalate in order to preempt. So that's the second scenario.
And
The
that would, in
third,
theory, will pull also Russia and others into the game, right? I mean, if that, yeah.
potentially, yes. I'll touch upon Russia in a minute. So that's second. The third scenario is the attrition scenario. Some of it we're already witnessing, and some of it we in Israel are witnessing for the last 2 years with the Houthis. You have an actor with long-range missiles capability. He's using them like we're using those drop irrigation that Israel is so famous for, drop by drop. And they're able to actually create almost total air curfew on the Israeli airspace and, harass 10 million Israelis that are losing sleep every other night because of the sirens, usually in the middle of the night. So the Iranians have a lot more capabilities, and if they choose attrition, they can certainly follow that path. Of course, Israel's response is going to be to what is already happening, trying to escalate and prevent the Iranians from choosing this avenue, but the Iranians can still do it.
Just to clarify, the
And
missile that Iran has, we see the damage by, and the attrition like that will
yes,
be disaster.
yes,
Yes.
exactly. And we see that they have some new capabilities. I don't know how many of you noticed that, but last night they used some very sophisticated missiles that accelerate at the very end of their route, which makes it more difficult to hit by our counter missile defense, and therefore the percentage out of 30 missiles, and I don't know exactly how many, but not insignificant number have penetrated, contrary to the past. So that's the third scenario, the attrition. And the last one, which is to me quite probable, and interesting, and actually has a lot of potential, is what I would call the coercive diplomacy scenario. In this scenario, essentially Trump, maybe with Putin, decide to put an end to the war and to force both sides to stop the war and reach an agreement. Those of you who are following very closely probably saw that the other day, Trump and Putin had a phone conversation, after which Trump declared that Putin offered his services as a mediator, and Trump accepted the offer. Again, with Trump, you never know what he means, what he actually said to Putin, if at all, whatever. But, and this is very important, I think, also yesterday, Trump became the first ever American president to speak about an Israeli-Iranian agreement. Okay? You wouldn't see it in the media. It somehow gets lost among all the information. But I think that it's a very, very intriguing prospect and a very, very intriguing diplomatic and political fact. An American president, that for the first time, speaks about an Israeli-Iranian agreement and says, I will bring it. You know, they should make a deal, and I'm happy to bring it. Again, on the one hand, I don't want to overstate the significance of this because it's Trump. On the other hand, I do think, one, that it does have significance, and secondly, that it has a lot of potential. So what I can envision is the following. First of all, a kind of coercive diplomacy vis-a-vis both Iran and Israel, forcing them to stop, a temporary ceasefire or whatnot. Then return to the negotiating table between the US, maybe now also with Russia, maybe with the Europeans, maybe JCPOA style, whatever, on the nuclear issue. And here the key question is, to what extent, if at all, will Iran soften its positions? And is there a chance that in that scenario, Iran will really succumb to the very difficult demands of America and Israel, eliminating the nuclear program, eliminating the missiles program, and so on? I have to say that I'm very skeptical on that. I don't think they can be coerced in that scenario into signing really what from their perspective would be a surrendering agreement. But short of that,
But that could be a reason. The reason for that could be to keep the regime, right? I mean, so if the regime is more important than the nuclear bomb, sorry, then keeping the regime could again, we can end up with this war and keeping the regime instead of like removing the regime.
yes, again, these are the factors that they will have to consider. But in this scenario, the way I envision it, there is a risk to the regime, but they're not on the verge of collapse or anything like that. And they calculate that the best avenue for them is at least to attempt negotiations. It will buy them time, it will stop the war, you know, it has all sorts of interesting ramifications for them, at least in the short run. And then one can envisage an agreement on kind of the highest level between Iran and the superpowers or the global powers. Then an agreement between Iran and Israel, which I think is important. First of all, I think it's a very interesting opportunity, but also I think because we're in such an age where we cannot trust anyone, including, excuse me if there are some Trump supporters here, I don't think we can trust Trump as Israelis. And therefore, it's going to be good for us if we have kind of a bilateral set of agreements and based on deterrence, but also on some sort of understandings between us and the Iranians, which essentially, again, I don't want to oversimplify, but essentially means non-belligerency.
Something similar to what we had with Syria, maybe, or right, or a ceasefire agreement you're talking about, or you're talking about something.
Yes,
we're not talking about peace agreement. We're talking about some kind of like ceasefire agreement.
Exactly. Even less than a ceasefire. It's non-belligerency. We don't attack you as long as you don't attack us, and vice versa.
Cold War.
Both directly and indirectly. It's kind of the opposite of a regime change, or planning the elimination of the Zionist regime from their perspective. We're gonna go our separate ways, if you want.
Iran, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
And the last point, and with this I'll open it to questions.
Mm-hmm.
If you remember, until a few days ago, we were not speaking about Iran and the war with Iran and so on. We were speaking about the Palestinian issue, Gaza, the hostages, and the so-called Saudi-French initiative, which was designed as a way to end the war in Gaza and to break forward with a new regional agreement, regional security architecture, with a two-state solution at its core, including normalization between Israel and Saudi, and so on and so forth. This was supposed to take place on June 17, which is tomorrow, in New York, at the UN headquarters, at the level of heads of state and foreign ministers. MBS, Macron, many others were supposed to be there. And the whole idea was to create a momentous event where it would be clear that there is a very kind of clear, charted path towards stabilization of the Middle East via diplomatic means, including ending the Gaza war and relaunching, if you want, a peace process or a diplomatic process between Israel and the Palestinians within a new regional framework. And if we try to connect the dots here, I think there is an interesting opportunity, which I don't think this Israeli government will take, but the next Israeli government should take or must take, to reshape the region, not only by military means, but also by diplomatic means, by completing this set of agreements, the ones that we are party to and the ones that we are not. To repeat, one is Iran, the US, and potentially the other global powers on the nuclear issue. The other is Israel, Iran, non-belligerency. And the third is a new regional security architecture, normalization with Saudi, Saudi-French initiative, including a two-state solution at its core. I'll stop here.
So you touched the current government. So let's for a second remind everyone that again we are still talking about the Ben Gvir Smotrich Netanyahu government. This has not changed from 4 days ago. We are still talking about 53 hostages that are in Gaza. 20 of them believed to be alive. There is a video yesterday from Elia, one of the released hostages, that was basically opening the video last night while there was bombing and said, like, listen, I mean, like, now I understand what you don't understand that we went through and people are went through in Gaza and the hostages underground. So with this notion, when we are looking into the scenario of common sense, is that something that we currently see more? I mean, we know that the current government is being almost silent. I mean, they're starting to talk now, but I mean, like they let them out of the bunker, so everyone is now talking their regular talk about winning, total victory and winning, and as much as it's going to take, and all those statements. Do we think that there is enough power, or do we see something from the opposition, like Gantz and others, that might come and save the day again to end up this war in a negotiation or a ceasefire, which we haven't been able to do in 18 months in Gaza?
I can speak freely in this forum, right?
You can speak freely in this forum.
Even if you, no matter what
I
you
mean,
say.
again, we are all we all love Israel here, and we all think that the best. What's
No, I'm joking. I'm
important.
joking. I always speak freely.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
It's still allowed in Israel. Also, I'm not in Israel, so
You're stuck in Paris, right?
exactly.
Yes.
This government, this prime minister, is not interested in releasing the hostages or in ending the war in Gaza. That's very clear. I'd go even further to say that as far as Netanyahu and his cabinet are concerned, the hostages are considered dead already. They have no intention of releasing them. How do I know that? There is an agreement that they signed on January of this year that on a considerable level of detail, even though they didn't, of course, they hid it from the public, the actual text, but it was published at least partially, so you can see it on Google. It's a very clear text that has 3 phases of implementation. And in phase 2, all the hostages are to be released. All hostilities are to be stopped, permanent ceasefire, and all IDF soldiers are to evacuate Gaza. This is what this Israeli government signed on in January of this year, and then decided in March, if I remember correctly, to break and abrogate and abandon, with, unfortunately, the green lighting again, the permission from Trump. So all those, excuse me, BS that they're telling us about negotiations and about the potential for the release of this number or that number, it's all BS. They could have released all of them. They should have, of course, released all of them in January or March, and they chose not to. And I don't think that's going to change in terms of their strategy. There is one caveat that is now being produced as we speak, literally, because of this new situation with Iran. And again, I give it very low probability, but now it's beyond zero. It's a little bit above zero. That Netanyahu takes the win if we are in the first scenario that I described, and there is a so-called decisive victory against Iran, and they are brought to their knees, and blah 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 blah. And Netanyahu decides that it's time for him to cash on this and go to elections, then he might also close the Gaza file and release the hostages. But it's entirely up to him. It is up to him. It was up to him. All again, this BS that is being sold about Smotrich and Ben Gvir, it's all BS. There's nothing but Netanyahu in terms of decision making in Israel now. When I speak to Europeans or Americans, I tell them stop thinking about Israel like you think about a liberal democracy like France or Germany and so on. Think about Israel now like you think about Russia or Turkey, with Putin and Erdogan. That's what we have. Period. So
all those
I
statements
don't
about the
think
cabinet approved or not approved, you're saying this is not happening under cabinet. There is no questioning even about what
no,
Netanyahu is offering.
nothing. Whatever Netanyahu wants is what happens. Period. So, and he doesn't want the hostages released, and he doesn't want the Gaza war to end. Period. So that's what we're looking at. But you had another issue beyond that I forgot.
Yeah. So again, I mean, like the question is, I mean, I think that we talked
You
about.
mentioned Gantz and you called him an opposition. He's not an opposition.
Yeah, no, I know.
The coalition in reserve. Yeah.
Coalition in reserve.
Yes.
I mean, so again, to those of you who are not, again, just to put in context, every time there is what we call together we will win, and again, all of us wants to win this war, right? I mean, there is the opposition, so-called, is coming into the government for unity, and I want to talk about this unity because again, we all want in theory unity, but we need to remember that one of the things we are seeing now in this war is the liberalism and innovation and what democracy is generating in Israel, which is in looks like the Mossad and like the technology and like the defense system and others, right? That was grown out of Israel over the last years as a deterrence and as a protection from us being in theory annihilated, and we are fighting a regime of Ayatollah and others. So, I mean, do you see this? Do you see this something that's happening right now in Israel, that people are talking about the differences? Like, again, this government was basically, this government is using everything that they were propagated against it, right? I mean, like everyone was calling the pilots like they should go away and so on. So how do you see this war being being in a way used or being leveraged to understand better the risk, what would happen to Israel if we don't win this war in Iran, and if we don't take it into the next stage where we have to save democracy, using that example?
Anyone here familiar with Irish diplomacy? Let me tell you what Irish diplomacy is. Of course, it's a joke, but you'll understand why I'm telling it. Irish diplomacy goes as follows. You're petting the dog on the back and telling him, good doggy, with your left hand, when your right hand is searching for the stick. This is what's happening with this government under the guise of this war. It was happening under the guise of the Gaza war, and now it's happening under the guise of the Iran war. It's all means to an end. And the end is completing the dictatorial coup, changing the regime in Israel. If you want, under the guise of pursuing a regime change in Iran, they're actually pursuing a regime change in Israel. And it's already underway. It's happening all the time, not only in the Knesset, through various means. They're taking over the media, they're taking over any government institution, including the most sensitive ones. By taking over, I mean politicizing them. Case in point is the head of Shin Bet, one of the most sensitive and powerful institutions in Israel, including when it comes to eavesdropping and sanctioning political opposition. And it's not a coincidence that Netanyahu is targeting it and has now nominated or is trying to nominate illegally a non-professional, not somebody from the Shin Bet, but somebody who is a Netanyahu loyalist and a zealot, a messianic zealot. And it's just one example. It's happening across the board.
And
So it's
just to kind of like
it's textbook
yeah,
dictatorial coup. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would just want to mention, I mean, like Netanyahu was talking in his public announcement that this was planned and for the attack in April, and it was delayed, and so on and so on. And at the same time that he was planning that marvelous surprise, if you want to say, on Iran, that of course has consequences on the Israelis on the ground. There is like the eighth front that he described, that he's fighting against the deep state.
Yes.
So
You
so
need to be
you're saying
yeah.
basically that one of the scenarios that almost like we forgot is that while we had to attack maybe based on intelligence to preempt the preemptive attack, there is also an underneath assumption that this is being used as a shock doctrine to finish the judicial overhaul.
Absolutely. No question about it. And word on the opposition, unfortunately, we have a very feeble opposition, with the exception of Yair Golan, who's not a member of Knesset. And, full disclosure, I'm a member of Golan's party and I support him. But other than Golan and Kariv and Lazimi, the four Knesset members that the old Labor has in Knesset, all the other opposition is not really an opposition. There are degrees, but essentially they're not an opposition, and certainly not an effective.
But just to be fair, I mean, like even Yair Golan again supported this act of war. I mean, I don't think that anyone was against this attack. There is definitely a criticism about, and now we see it on the ground in Israel, that while we were planning, I mean, again, if you compare the military and the Mossad and all the preparation, comparing to how the government is prepared איך אומרים עורף?
Home front.
The home front, that's where the difference is. We are not prepared as much as we should have.
I would describe it a little differently. I would
Okay.
put it this way. If Yair Golan were the prime minister, this war would not occur. And not only would it not occur, in June 2025, the circumstances leading to June 2025 that actually began, if you want, you can go back perhaps even, wherever, but I'm thinking about 2018, when Netanyahu as prime minister pushed Trump to drop out of the JCPOA. This is not something that, Yair Golan as a prime minister would have done. So, and if you want, is the primal sin. Once this happened, it opened the road to where we are now. So that's
So I
what
want
I
to
have.
take to touch on the scenario, and we might, if you have another 5 minutes, we can extend it a little bit because there are many questions here coming in. There is a scenario now that we are dealing with. People asking, like, why do we need permission from the U.S. to attack Fordo or even continue this war? I mean, like, and on the same time, we need to remember. I will just add that it's not just a permission from the United States now. It's almost the permission from the most extreme MAGA people on Trump that are totally against joining the war.
Yeah.
And they might start. I mean, we just saw Marjorie and others, which are kind of like equivalent to the other side of the squad on the other side.
Yes.
And in a way, why do we need this permission? And how does it affect the length of the war? How does it affect this relationship?
Well, first of all, I didn't use the word permission, but there is a total strategic dependency of Israel or in the US by Israel. We're totally dependent on the US. When we speak about the vulnerable Israeli Air Force, which aircrafts do you think they're actually piloting? They're piloting F-35s and F-16 and F-15 and other American planes. Israel does not manufacture any airplane. We tried back in the, when was it, 80s and failed miserably. So we're totally dependent on American gear, on American armaments, and the burnout rate of armaments in the Gaza war and in the Lebanon war was such that the Americans had to supply us in real time on unimaginable scales. And this will be the case now. If it's not already the case, then it's going to be the case very quickly because we're using so much armament that very quickly we're going to need more and more American supplies. And as we know, this administration released, I don't remember the exact numbers, but he released several thousand certain types of aerial bombs that the previous administration blocked. So there's no question that the Israeli Air Force is totally dependent on American supplies. And it goes not only to the Israeli Air Force, it goes to most, if not all, of the parts of the Israeli military. Also on intelligence, there are certain American assets that we don't have in terms of satellite imagery and all sorts of other very kind of extremely expensive, sophisticated, cutting edge installations and machinery and whatnot that we simply don't have. Secondly, the only reason that Israel was able and is able to conduct this level of warfare, unlike perhaps any other country, is that we have the American cover in the UN Security Council by
The
way of
veto. Yeah.
the veto. Without American veto, for example, the Gaza war would have ended a long time ago because the UN Security Council would have made a decision, including, under Chapter 7, that forces Israel to cease and desist or face sanctions. And this would have been the case also with respect to this war with Iran, absent an American veto. I could go on, but
Just to
I think
clarify,
I made the point. So it's not a question. No, I would say a few more words.
yeah.
It was clear, and now I'm speaking obviously as a former official and as somebody who's been in cabinet rooms and in strategic dialogues with the US and so on. I know what I'm talking about. It's always been the assumption that Israel cannot attack Iran without America knowing about it and without America sanctioning it. Okay? This has always been the decision. And if you go through some of the more kind of savvy veteran journalists in Israel, people like Ronen Bergman or Nahum Barnea or Aluf Ben, and you read what they're writing in recent days about kind of the runoff to the decision on this war, you'll see that they're saying that there was a very strict demand by the chief of staff of the IDF, maybe by others, to get an American green light, or at least not a red light, to make sure that we don't have an American red light before we decide to launch this war. And then I could go on, but I'll
Yeah,
stop here.
but I think that
Divulge any-
two
yeah.
points that are important is like again, first of all, the armament of the munition of like attacking for is probably something Israel doesn't have on its own, right? So that would
Right.
be something that we have to deal with the US, and also the
Yeah, but
defense is
let's distinguish between American assistance to Israel and American intervention in the war.
okay.
America sending bombers, B-2 bombers or whatnot, to bomb Fordow is not like sending bombs to Israel. right? It's different.
And the other part is that we are dependent on so much. I mean, and again, I mean, like we are now in a situation that the reality is that France and UK and other members that usually helped us are helping us now as well, because at the first attack by Iran there was a coalition that was
Yes.
helping us defending the missiles and the drones and others. And it's worth mentioning that Jordan did participate in the beginning also in removing
Yeah.
drones, right? What does the
Yeah,
situation
it's a
looks
good
like right
point.
now?
We hardly mentioned the Europeans, and perhaps unfairly. I would say that their position on this is quite interesting. One would imagine that they would actually condemn Israel's war of choice against Iran in the midst of negotiations that the Europeans were very happy to see through. They were not party to, but they very much wanted an agreement to be reached. But their position is quite supportive, and they're supporting Israel's right to defend itself, even though Israel was not attacked by Iran. So my conclusion is that they were probably shown some very serious intelligence material that convinced them that Iran was indeed in breach of its of the agreements and of the NPT and the additional protocol and so on, and essentially were pursuing nuclear weapon in one way, shape, or form. And that's why they have kind of essentially allowed Israel or support tacitly what Israel is doing. But they are stopping short, as you say, from actually defending Israel the way they did in previous rounds, maybe as a way of putting pressure on Israel not to go too far and not to prevent an agreement that they are still seeking with Iran.
Yeah. Eran, I want to really thank you for this analysis. It was enlightening, and it's definitely going to be a continuation to that. I want to thank you all for joining on this morning, evening. Let's hope everyone is safe in Israel. Send our thoughts to the victims, to the wounded, to the soldiers, and mostly let's make sure that this war is ending soon. And we get the hostages back home, which is, I think, is the most important thing still. And thank you everyone who is taking any type of form of reminding the government to return, to bring back home the hostages. So I will
Amen.
I will keep posting stuff on the social media. Follow Eran on social media, on X, I think you are mostly, right, Ron? Um,
Sorry,
and
I missed that. What did you say?
you are on X, your social media is mostly on X.
Yeah,
On yes,
of
yeah,
course.
yeah,
I'm on X. Yes,
yeah. I will post it on the summary in the recording.
sure.
And be safe here and there, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
And thank you
Bye bye.
to all our team that helped co-hosted this event. Bye bye.